This is Canon Fodder, episode 11. My guest this week is Twitter writer and group chat annoyer, Mazer Rackham Jr. Mazer, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good. I'm feeling extra annoying tonight.
Wonderful. Yes, I had you on for your annoyance. For those of you out there who don't know, Mazer and I are part of sort of the same circles, I guess, on Twitter. And over the summer, I called him out, did a writing challenge. We had a short story contest between the two of us. We had several judges, and it ended up being a tie, which I wanted to contest because my story was clearly superior. But to give him his due, Mazer did put out a pretty good work. So now I'm having him on my podcast to show that I am gracious.
It's very magnanimous of you.
But speaking of magnanimous, I guess we can get right into The Once and Future King by T.H. White. I really enjoyed this book. I read Arthurian legends, kind of as a kid. The one that I had growing up was Steinbeck's version, right? So
That one's unfinished, right?
Yep, that one's unfinished, and then also, and it's kind of American. But this sort of the version that I have is 4 novels in one, so it's a pretty beefy book. And I think there's even a fifth novel that doesn't get included, but White did write, and it was released posthumously. So why don't you tell me your relationship to the book and kind of how you got started with it and why you picked it?
Yeah. So the book is Once and Future King, which is just to kind of quickly summarize how it's structured because it's a little bit different than it's sort of a uniquely structured book. It's actually 4 short novels that were then collected as one volume. The first book being Sword in the Stone, the second book being The Queen of Air and Darkness, the third book being The Ill-Made Knight, and then the fourth book, which was actually never published by itself. When the fourth book was written, they were then compiled as one volume, but the fourth book is called The Candle in the Wind. And so it's it's a big book. It evolves pretty naturally over the course of those 4 volumes. I don't remember when I first heard of it, but I sort of had a copy lying around for one reason or another, and then a good friend of mine who I trust to recommend books. Somehow we were talking about desert island books or favorite books or something like that, and he said this book, which was not shocking, but it wasn't the book I expected him to say because he tends to read more. He's like a big James Ellroy fan, so
Right.
I was expecting like a crime book or a Western or something like that. And so for me, it's one of those things where when someone recommends a book that you don't expect them to recommend, it kind of like that made my ears prick up. And so I was like, well, I want to see why this book out of all the books that this guy could have said. And so I read it. I believe that was over COVID. It was over the first COVID year. And I wound up just blowing through it. And I wound up when I reread it for this podcast, and I wound up blowing through it again. Like I just find it very compulsively readable. It goes all over the place tonally. It goes all over the place in terms of kind of how he follows all the different characters. And there's something about just a book that's willing to take you to that many locations and to have that much fun doing it. And it became one of my favorites as well.
It's definitely a fun book, and it's an easy read. I highly recommend it to anybody. It's something like 800 pages, but you really do breeze right through it. It's written for children, so it's not written for children in a way that's like you're going to feel like an idiot reading it or you're going to feel dumb, because it's a very good story. But it's written for children in a way that you're able to pick up the concepts. He's not doing a whole lot in terms of, he's not writing Joyce or Melville.
No.
Right? He's taking a story that, especially in England at the time, would be known very well by your average person, and adding his own sort of twists to it without kind of veering from Mallory's original works.
Right. And the thing about it being 4 different individual books is that makes it read quicker too, because any particular narrative thread that you're on is going to hit something like a resolution within 100 pages.
If you had to pick a favorite of the 4, which would you say?
The third one, the Ill-Made Knight, which is, for people who haven't read it, that's the one that covers Lancelot and sort of his affair with Guinevere and the sort of the problems that starts to bring to Arthur's project of Camelot and of uniting England. That's the book that covers that part of it. Which
that's probably the best written of the 3 as well.
Yeah, and it gets the most into, like, it has the most character texture. You know, it really spends a lot of time sort of interrogating Lancelot and Guinevere's motives for doing what they're doing, and also Arthur's motives for kind of not dealing with it, and then for dealing with it in the way that he chooses to deal with it and all that kind of stuff, where a lot of the rest of the book skims over. It will sort of gesture, I think, very thoughtfully towards people's psychology, but it doesn't really sit there in their psychology a lot. But in the third book, he really, that's quite a bit of it is that. And I'm not a big King Arthur expert, actually, but my understanding is that the Lancelot Guinevere affair is kind of a later addition to the corpus of the mythology, and that some people sort of find it to be a out of place, like an out of place later add-on. But I think, at least the way White handles it, I think he really does a lot of work to justify why this would happen to these people and why they would react the way they do. And I think it's a very sad, kind of compelling look at people just deciding to throw away something really beautiful.
So the Lancelot edition, if it's an edition, I'm not I don't know much about the Arthur lore as well, but everything that I know about it, the Lancelot edition is necessary to the rise and fall of Camelot, because you have Arthur, who creates this code of chivalry, in which also God himself ordains it, right?
Right.
And right will always trump might, except in this one case, right? So you can't have the fall of chivalry unless you have this sort of fallen knight who embodies everything that's to come with the fall of Camelot.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I'm just sort of relaying what I've seen. You know, you follow some of these more educated classics text guys on Twitter, right. And I've just seen people mention that about the Lancelot thing a couple of times, but I think it works like really beautifully here.
Most definitely, I agree with you there. So what we'll do is we'll go over each of the books, and we'll do a brief discussion and summary of them, and then we'll see where we land, and make sure to pause me when you have something interesting to say about any of them. Okay. So, The Sword and the Stone. Now, I remember actually growing up, there was a Disney movie, The Sword and the Stone, that I watched as a kid, and I didn't know that they were the same. They were the same thing,
Yes.
Right away, T.H. White lets you know that it puts himself in the book without diminishing or changing the text, just by adding anachronisms. Do you know anything about that? Like why he he adds allusions to wristwatches or communism, or there's even like a reference to Hitler in, I think, the second book.
There's little bits where he says that that someone was going to school in Eton, and then he clarifies, well, not really Eton, but you wouldn't know what it was, so I'm just going to say Eton.
Right. So any knowledge there? Is it just to make it?
I don't have knowledge, but the way I read it is, the way the book seems to be written to me is that T.H. White clearly deeply adores the Mallory text. And I think what he's trying to do is capture some of the lifeblood and the energy and the kind of like tragedy and romance of that text in a way that is more accessible. And so I think he's just kind of jumping in with those anachronisms, because that's part of his project, is to self-consciously be a modern author looking back at the old story. And so it just feels like part of that to me, like this sort of very deliberate, I am an Englishman in the 1930s.
Right. Makes
kind
sense.
of perspective that he has. That's how
Right.
I kind of take it, and it's funny.
So it starts out with this young man named the Wart. The Wart is a ward of a British knight named, I think it's Sir Ector, right?
Yeah.
And Sir Ector has a son, Kay, and they're brought up together. The two young men are brought up together as brothers, and Wart has no sort of aspirations in life. You know, he thinks that he's a commoner. He thinks that he's just lucky to be where he's at, and his ambition kind of throughout the book is, oh, I just want to have fun, and I also want to one day be a knight or a squire to Kay, who I know is going to be a knight because he's noble, right? So right away, White is, uh, picking up that uh, those lines from Mallory, and he's making it very apparent that uh, one of the reasons that Arthur is so different, and Wart is Arthur, by the way. Spoilers for all you people out there who don't know about this story. Uh, Arthur is different because he grows up sort of a commoner, right? Who is actually a king, and this is a trope going back to scripture. Even you've got the king born in a manger kind of thing,
Hmm.
right? Uh, so yeah, any thoughts on the beginnings of this book?
Um, None in particular. I think Kay is a really well drawn character. I think that's the one of the little kind of MVP, stealth MVP of the first book is like the Kay character in his sort of his earnest pursuit of being a knight and his kind of boneheadedness and the way that he doesn't really own his own destiny and sometimes feels out of his depth, especially as Arthur starts become at which you're kind of getting you'll get to this in a minute, but as Arthur starts being educated by Merlin, Kay
Mm-hmm.
starts to feel sort of insecure in his and I just think the way that Kay is drawn sets him up as a foil for Arthur like very well.
Right, right. So Arthur kind of goes on this quest. His hunting falcon goes missing, right? And he goes into the woods to find it, and he runs into Merlin. He runs into a few people, King Pellinor, right,
Hmm.
who's always on this on the hunt for like this unhuntable creature, right?
The
What's the creature?
questing beast.
The questing beast. Yes. Uh, so he's and he, you know, Arthur doesn't really know what he's, what this guy's motives are, so he's kind of leery of him, right? But he finally finds Merlin. Merlin invites him into his home, uh, and one thing leads to another. Merlin is the instructor for the two boys at the castle, right? But
Right.
it's very apparent right away that the Wart or Arthur. I mean, I'm just gonna call him Arthur, right?
Yeah.
Because it's just the Wart is whatever. But so Arthur is clearly favored by Merlin. Kay tries not to voice his displeasure at this, but
Right.
Arthur, feeling that there needs to be a certain fairness, right? This sense of justice is early seen in Arthur, that he
Yeah.
wants Kay to be brought with him as well, and to be able to turn into animals and do all these fun things that Arthur is able to do.
Right. Because he doesn't see that he's any more important than Kay is.
He thinks he's less important.
Right.
He thinks he's nobody, and that he's living a charmed life because of the kindness of Sir Ector.
Right.
So he ends up fighting Morgan Le Fay, right?
Yeah. They wind up
And
trying to they raid her castle, I believe.
yep, and Kay he kills a griffin, right?
Hmm.
So this shows like right away that Kay is going to be a formidable knight in the future.
Right.
Uh, there's also towards the end, right? Throughout the background of the book, everybody's talking about because of Uther Pendragon's death, the kingdoms, the kingdom that was once one has been fractured into many, and the sword Excalibur has been put into a smelting iron into a stone, right? And all of the all of the knights of England are to, almost go on pilgrimage to see this thing and to
Hmm.
try and pick it up, right? Uh, and one of my favorite parts of the book is Kay is about to go, jousting, or he's about to, go into a tournament, right? Doesn't have a sword, so Arthur, being his squire, goes and fetches him this sword, right?
Right.
And he's like, "Hey, look, I got you a sword. I'm your. I have no idea what I've just done, but here's the sword." And Kay almost takes it for himself. He's allure the allure of being the king is so tempting to him that he almost lets himself take away Arthur's birthright.
Right. And there's
And it's
almost this idea of like, it's like, well, it can't be Arthur.
right. And it's so Ector, it's only when Ector eggs him on, because Ector knows the whole time, right? Ector
Hmm.
knows exactly who Arthur is. He knows who he's going to be. Uh, and it's only when Ector says, "Kay, did you really take the sword out of the stone?" And Kay finally relents and says, "No, it was Arthur." And they kneel down to him, and Arthur's crying because he sees this man who's been his father his whole life kneeling down to him, and he's like, "You got to stop, please," like. And Ector the whole time he's just saying, "Well, whatever you do, just please have something for my son here."
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, I find the way that White renders that scene to be very touching. Because he does a good job of capturing like Arthur, like it's all changing almost quicker than Arthur can understand what's going on. That everything's kind of gotten flipped on its head. His relationships with all these people have suddenly become completely inverted, and I think White captures this kind of like slightly dumb kid suddenly becoming king in a very touching way.
There's another aspect I wanted to touch on in the first book. It's the way that Merlin perceives time. So
Yeah,
Merlin goes through time backwards, and
right.
I think White does a really good job of not breaking that rule, but not playing with it so much that he could break it.
Yes.
It's covered very. It's mentioned without being explained too much.
Yeah, and he kind of gets away from some of the stuff that would be really and truly disruptive to the narrative by just having Merlin be confused by that a good chunk of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
which
I
it
hate
is
Merlin.
funny. Oh, really? What about him?
Oh, just I mean, like, he's got a very White is very much putting himself, I think, in Merlin, especially when it comes to politics.
Hmm.
And like the yeah, I'll just say that the I almost don't believe Merlin sometimes, especially in the second book when he's giving Arthur his sort of political philosophy.
Sure. Yeah.
Right, White is clearly an English liberal of the 20th century and
Yes.
probably does not believe in absolute monarchy.
Right.
So there's kind of a disconnect there where Merlin is that mouthpiece for 20th century English liberalism,
Hmm.
and Arthur is not that, and I don't think
Right.
it does the Arthurian legend some disservice to try and pigeonhole the good society. It's like almost saying like, oh, everything that I like is good, and everything that I don't like is bad.
Uh huh. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that's more of a problem with White than I do with the actual problem or the character of Merlin. It's funny.
Sure.
I did an episode with Zero HP Lovecraft about that hideous strength, and Merlin
Hmm.
pops up there as an important character. Um, so just very funny how that kind of works out. A lot of Merlin on the brain.
Yeah. Well,
So
and kind of a good. I mean, just this side point, but a good kind of echoing back to your earlier point of just how familiar this story is to the English in particular. Like it's just it's in. I mean, it pops up. The Arthur myth is like such a part of the fabric of their culture, and particularly their sort of fantasy heritage.
Definitely. Yep. Especially, and even just the name Pendragon is just like so
Right.
ubiquitous. So second book, right?
Yes. Hard tone shift.
Yes. Yes, definitely. So the Queen of Air and Darkness, we see a grown-up Arthur, right? He's been his as he is matured physically, he is also matured mentally, and this whole book is basically him bringing the kingdom together. We haven't gotten to peak Camelot yet. We don't have the Knights of the Round Table. Arthur's not married yet. Uh, in fact,
He's
throughout
not even fully king of England yet.
right, he's king of whoever says that he's king. You
Right.
know, you have sort of these Cornish young men who Gawain and Gareth and oh geez, what are the other names?
There's four of them.
Yep, but there's it's funny because they're kind of like bumbling,
Uh-huh.
but they're also just they're savage warriors. The Orkney clan, right?
Yes.
And the Orkneys wish to fight Arthur because Uther Pendragon raped their grandmother,
Right.
right? Who is mother to the Orkney boys. So you have Morgause, queen of the Orkney clan, married to King Lot, who, I mean, to use a modern day word, he's ultimately longhoused,
Hmm.
right? He's sort of a kept man, a kept
Uh-huh.
king, and does whatever it is that Morgause wants him to do because reasons, because she just has this power over him. Any thoughts on the Orkneys, or you feel free to take
Oh,
over
yeah. No,
whenever you want.
yeah. I didn't know how far you were going to go. Yeah, I think I mean the most striking thing, kind of I just mentioned it, but it's just like how because the first book, The Sword in the Stone, is very kid. It's very funny. He changes into animals a lot. There's a couple of sort of darker scenes where there's a death or something, but by and large, it's very kid friendly. It reads sort of like Wind in the Willows or something. And then you get to this, and I mean, essentially, the first scene is kind of like a dark act of witchcraft that involves boiling a live cat. And there's the Orkneys are very violent, kind of out on the fringes, down on their luck. Kind of, there's just a much different and more brutal texture, and to experience it just kind of almost on the page flip from this kid pulls a sword out of a stone and becomes king, and everyone gives him all these gifts, and it's in the time traveling wizard is there, and it's just it immediately broadens kind of what the book is capable of and what the book is getting after.
Right. I mean, even the scene where the Orkney boys kill a unicorn for their mother, I did not I didn't like that at all. I
Yeah,
felt I felt so
it's
sorry
horrifying.
for the unicorn, and especially because and what White does really well is he lets you put the context in which you already understand these things to work for him, right?
Yes.
So everybody understands how rare and how special a unicorn is, right? I mean,
Right.
just to men say that they find a unicorn when they find a beautiful woman who isn't crazy, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so for the Orkneys to slaughter this rare, beautiful thing,
Yeah, and
White,
he renders it really violently too.
right? But White, he allows you to bring in your preconceptions and plays with them in a way that makes it that scene even more powerful. And he does that throughout the novel. I mean, he does that with just the Arthurian legend in general. He's assuming that everybody knows this story, and I
Right.
think he does that very effectively. You couldn't do that with younger tales, but because this story is like 1,000 years old, maybe less,
Right.
like 600 years old,
Yeah,
700.
I don't want to say a number and be wrong, but I think it would have to be something like that.
right, closer to 1,000 than it is to 100. We'll say.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Right. So it because it's just so well known, he and he doesn't subvert expectations. He doesn't disrespect the work in that way.
Oh no.
Instead, he plays. We all know where the road is going, but he makes the drive entertaining. Let's say,
Yes.
right?
And he's able to drop in those moments of kind of very human cruelty, and without, I think, kind of what you're saying, without violating the true fantasy of what's going on. It doesn't feel like he's demystifying it. It just feels like he's complicating it, or just he just finds interesting ways to juxtapose things against it.
So we have a little aside. We have Pellinor trying to find the questing beast. He's joined by Palamedes and Grumor, right? Palamedes is a Moor that they met in the Crusades, or a Saracen rather. They met in the Crusades, which is pretty interesting. And Pellinor is about to get married, right? He's going to give up the questing beast, which is sort of his. Apparently, this happens in the Mallory text, and it's never fully explained. So White kind of explains it away, and suddenly Palamedes is now the one finding the questing beast. If there was a time to editorialize, that probably would have been it for me. But I understand why White just keeps the story as he understands it.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of a good place where the fact that he probably should have cleaned that up, or at least arguably should have cleaned that up, is kind of a good indication of how much he's trying to preserve the source material.
Right. I think of Peter Jackson making the Lord of the Rings, when he says that it's not his to editorialize, it's not his to change anything. And unfortunately, probably better than anybody else, just because of the conversations that we've had and the work that you do, that's just not how modern storytellers, let's say, treat their source material.
Right. And I do think that's, I mean, to just kind of stay on that topic for a moment, I mean, if there's anything that I think is, aside from just liking the book, one of the main things that I think is sort of deeply valuable about what White is doing here is it's an example of, we're in a space and in a time where there's a sort of felt need to rediscover and rehabilitate, and on both, on all sides of the cultural sort of conversation, everybody's trying to figure out what to do with all the stuff we have behind us. And, the guys that we're kind of in conversation with feel one way about it. The people in, more mainstream type circles feel a different way about it. But White, to me, here is like giving such a good model of how to rehabilitate something and bring it forward without trying to turn it into yourself, by trying to preserve the thing that is actually happening in it.
Yeah. And
even though, like you say, you can see that he is a 20th century English liberal, and he has certain skepticisms that wouldn't have been present in the source material. He's trying to set those to one side throughout most of this book. And he's trying to mostly he clearly loves Lamort Arthur and wants you to love it too. And the best way that he knows to make you love it is to write this book.
Definitely. Now another, and I'm skipping to the end here.
Yeah. Well, and this book is a little diffuse as far as like narrative goes. It's a little, it's easy to kind of just sort of hit the high points on this one.
There's one sort of moment in the battle where he has a Henry V moment. There are these peasants, and the knights want to have some fun by killing them, and he realizes that the main narrative, or the main theme of this book, I would say, is might does not equal right.
Yeah, it's him trying to figure out what that sort of core ideal of Camelot is going to be.
Right. So, we there's that small scene where, Arthur realizes that killing for the sake of killing is wrong and that knights should be held to a higher standard, which is, all good stuff.
Right.
End of the novel. Morgause seduces Arthur.
Hmm.
We have no idea. It is not it's not explained why, but very, very clearly does Arthur. Well, actually, yeah, I won't say that because it's we're not sure what happens, and White decides not to editorialize here either. He's like, well, one thing leads to another. We're not sure who did what, but at the
Hmm.
end of the day, Arthur willing or knowingly or unknowingly has sex with his own sister and produces a son of incest.
Hmm.
Right, and this is the setup to the fall of Camelot, because one could almost say that the whole purpose of the first two books is to set up the third. The third, and the third is your favorite for a reason, but the third is really where most of the action happens. Even the fourth is kind of like, yeah, whatever. The fourth is echoing what happens in the third.
Yeah,
if
I think that's
if
right.
White were to write any of the books only, right, instead of doing
Right.
all four, he would probably only just write the third one, because that's where
Yeah.
the bulk of the action, the bulk of this is where the questing is. It's where Lancelot is introduced.
Well,
Most of
it's
the
the part that's like about Camelot.
right. Um, yeah. So I mean, that's the second book. That's
Yeah, the one thing I want to mention that's just personally something I like about the second book is I think it's very funny how schizophrenic the tone gets at places where I think there's a chapter where within the same chapter, kind of across like a double space, you kind of go from uh, Pellinor and his guys are trying to like seduce the questing beast by dressing up as another questing beast, which is basically just like a Wallet and Gromit
yeah.
joke, a Wallace and Gromit joke. And then the next scene is the Orkneys trying to like almost killing one of their own brothers. This fratricide, this very and there's very few authors who can get away with those kinds of hard one right after the other. I will go anywhere. I will do any tone. I can write any scene.
Yeah.
I
It
just think
doesn't feel like Whiplash though.
no. I think White is all very effective at what it's doing. At the one at being very funny and the other at being very disturbing and dark. And I just there's a lot of stuff like that in this book, and I just kind of at a certain point I'm just kind of sitting back in awe at his ability to do that.
So Book 3, The Ill-Made Knight, the sort of pinnacle of Arthur's power. This is when you think of Camelot, it's this period right now,
Yeah, this
right?
is what like a lot of the Excalibur movie is about. This part of the story.
So
Have
we
you seen
have.
Excalibur?
I haven't. No, I have
Okay.
not.
It deals. I mean, it deals a good chunk with Arthur collecting his knights and then the love triangle and stuff like
I've
that. So
seen.
it also covers some of this territory.
I've seen Monty Python's Holy Grail.
I mean, look, that I think that movie is in some ways maybe the most accurate film adaptation we've gotten of the story in some ways.
That's true.
But
King Arthur does know about the African versus the European swallow and how to get a coconut. So
that's
yes,
right. But anyway,
uh,
Ill-Made Night. I think Ill-Made Night's also the longest of the books.
you might be right there. It clocks in at almost 300 pages, so possibly.
Hmm.
So we have Lancelot. He's a young man that Arthur met once, and Lancelot, after meeting Arthur just the one time, he's completely enamored with Camelot, with the Round Table, with everything that Arthur's trying to do, right?
Yeah.
And he has to he's young at the time, so he has to go back to France, and the whole time he's just training, and he's training to be the best knight possible.
Right.
And because it's weird because he's so ugly, right? He's described as an ugly man. He names himself the the ill-made knight, right?
Yeah.
And this again kind of the this part of the Lancelot lore and the reason that Camelot falls is super necessary because you have this ugly man, and at the time ugliness and really throughout human history ugliness is sort of synonymous with villainousness, right? So to have the perfect knight, right? The most chivalrous, the best fighter, the most noble of the knights of the Round Table be this sort of ugly, brooding, monstrous guy, is very necessary to the story.
Hmm. And it's kind of like he wants to be the perfect knight to outshine that in some ways.
So we have Lancelot. He's pretty ticked off because Arthur he thinks that Arthur's forgotten about him.
Right.
Uh, Arthur marries Guinevere, and suddenly that's all of his attention goes to Guinevere, and Lancelot won't have it. And this it's weird. He sets the narrative sets up Lancelot hating Guinevere only for them to both fall in love.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, what are your thoughts of Lancelot?
I think that, well, I think his stuff is some of the most affecting for me. The way that White, uh, he's the truly kind of damaged and tragic character. I mean, all the characters in the back half of the book are tragic in some way because the tragedy winds up touching. But Lancelot as a character is sort of poignantly tragic to a degree that nobody else in the story is. And I think that White captures that kind of woundedness very well, and the way that the woundedness winds up motivating the things he does. I think there's places where the story requires these characters who are, superficially paragons of some sort of virtue or other. The ideal knight or the ideal king, or Camelot, the ideal kingdom. And there's places where White has to justify really bad things happening to or being done by these people. And I think he does a really good job of finding the credible motive or the credible mindset or the credible kind of like the way the events land on him, the way that Lancelot's purity is kind of broken down over the course of some of the book, um, is painful to read. I think it's very well done. I think White takes all that stuff really seriously and just like wrings really good literature out of it.
So Lancelot, he and Guinevere fall in love, right?
Yes,
Uh,
it's the sort of a smoldering love that goes on for a while before the affair actually happens.
right. And White also doesn't. Again, I almost wish he kind of would editorialize some of this stuff because it is a little bit jarring, but because again, he's assuming that people are familiar with the story, he can kind of
Mm-hmm.
just step he can step over the more minute details, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
uh so Lancelot decides, well, he's going to go on all these quests, he's going to stay away from Camelot because he has this tension within himself that he is in love with Guinevere, but he loves Arthur as well.
Right,
He
and he
how
he
how
can't
could he,
stay
yeah, how could he betray his king,
right.
the man that he has pledged his life and his sword to. And but at the same time, it would be like the most intimate betrayal to him to steal the man's wife and to make him a cuckold. uh Lancelot, he goes traveling, he he saves the life of one maiden named Elaine. They fall in love. They have a child, Galahad, who's kind of inconsequential to the story, unfortunately. His whole arc comes with the Holy Grail quest. But yeah, I mean, Lancelot is just trying to stay away as much as possible, and Arthur can't understand it.
Mm-hmm.
In the previous book, Merlin, who by the way, Merlin's out of the picture in this one. That's probably also why I like this book is more than the others, because Merlin's not in it. Merlin, he falls in love. This lady makes him fall in love with her,
Right.
and she uh, imprisons him for a couple hundred years. So Merlin's out of the picture completely by this point Arthur after finishing Arthur's education and warning Arthur that he is to be betrayed by his wife and his best friend. Right.
Yes.
And Arthur kind of forgets about this, but as soon as he sees some looks between Guinevere and Lancelot, he's like, "Oh, I wish that Merlin were here right now to guide me." But he doesn't want to believe it.
Right.
He's so in love with his wife, and he has so much affinity for Lancelot that he can't believe that they would betray him. And
Right. It's almost like he decides to forget what Merlin told him.
yes, he and that's the tension throughout the novel and the beginning of the next novel is that everyone knows what's going on but dare
Right.
not speak it,
Right.
because as soon as it's said out loud, as soon as there's accusations, Guinevere and Lancelot have to die.
Right. Because of Arthur's justice.
Yeah, justice demands that, and that's probably the tragic flaw of Arthur, is that he is just his he loves those close to him so much that he cannot have quote unquote perfect government.
Right.
And
And go ahead.
it's that love that is his downfall, right? And it's that love that his enemies, and especially Mordred, his bastard son, uh, born of incest, who brings about that, because if the pure love, let's say, of Arthur and Guinevere, or even of that Arthur has for his friends, especially Lancelot, is shown in its inverse through Mordred, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that White does a good job of putting that at odds with, the promise of Camelot is the round table is Arthur is not above sort of the law that he sets up. And that's
Right.
kind of the great promise of Camelot, is that it's not based on the petty whims of the king. But then he winds up trapped in this situation where he can't be forgiving of Lancelot and Guinevere if he ever finds out, because he's already promised that no one is above the law, not him, not anybody. And so he'll have to fulfill the requirements of justice, even if he didn't want to. So it does a very good job of catching him sort of in between his two highest loves, or his two highest ideals.
Right. And one would say that a king's first duty and first love is to his kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe if Arthur were brought up more traditionally, if he were told of his noble birth earlier on, this could have been avoided.
Mm-hmm.
But because he's brought up as a commoner, he's not a commoner. He's not like working in for a blacksmith or anything like that. He grows up in a castle and he gets an education, but he's not brought up.
He's not special.
Yes, he doesn't think of himself as special, and that's almost his downfall as well. If he thought that he was a little bit more above and a little bit more special, then he wouldn't be caught in this trap. But then maybe also the kingdom wouldn't have been as great as it was.
Right.
So yeah, very very well done. It's myths like this, right? Because White's obviously he's taking from Mallory, and Mallory was taking from legends across England, right?
Right.
But the reason that this story is so powerful and has so much staying power is because it's nuanced, it's beautiful. I started reading Anna Karenina, right? And I thought to myself, oh, I'm going to hate this lady, right?
Uh-huh.
Because of how terrible she obviously is, right?
Right.
Because I only knew, like the bullet points of
Yeah.
the story. And as I start reading it, I'm like, I want to stop reading right now because I can't imagine this woman betraying her family
Yeah.
like that.
Hmm.
Tragedy is only so good, or tragedy is only good when you're reading it and you just have to stop
Yeah. You
because
hate that it's happening.
you can't bear to go on.
Yeah.
And that's White does an excellent job of making that very obvious to the readers.
Hmm.
Do you want to talk about the Holy Grail?
Sure. The other thing I want to throw out, kind of on the same idea of like, I really like the way White interacts as a sort of modern person looking backwards as he writes this stuff. When he's writing the way that because Arthur is you could say that Arthur is a little bit pathetic, or he's at least he avoids action and all this stuff as the affair with between Lancelot and Guinevere plays out. And I think there's places where White throws in these little observations, basically saying something like, obviously, we as modern people know that this isn't that big of a deal, and that there's ways to handle this, and it all. But Arthur lived at a time where they thought this mattered a lot, and there's these little observations he throws back on the kind of like virtue or romance, or even just kind of the disposition of those people in this time, that has this almost kind of this like sad glimpse at a depth of the soul that is kind of lost in a modern society where everything just goes to the courts and gets settled on
Right.
paper.
Right. And
Um,
that's another thing, like in kind of what I was talking about with Merlin, White's little like interludes. He's obviously a man of his time, and probably more so a man of this time as well,
mhm.
unfortunately. But it's just so disheartening that he puts in those little asides
Yeah.
because
Well,
it's
I
like,
think the one I'm thinking of, which is the diagnosis of Arthur's sort of inaction, to me almost has a bit of a self awareness to it.
mm,
Like it almost has this sort of obviously we're moderns and we don't believe in virtue. Like this, it's almost
right.
a little too pointed in some ways. Although
Mm,
I do agree that I know what you're talking about, where sometimes his sort of like his sort of like modern political state conception of stuff does feel like it overrides
like even
in places.
outside the political, just
Yeah.
his virtue or lack thereof, or the things that
Hmm.
he thinks is important. Like I just had a chilling thought. Like, what if they tried to make a new Camelot for like the modern day,
Yeah.
and you've got uh, oh geez, like the answer to all of Arthur's problems is that he and Guinevere have an open marriage,
Right.
or they have like the Knights of
Yeah.
the Round Table are a polycule.
Uh,
Just like all these horrific ideas have just come into my
yeah.
mind, and I think we should move on before I have an
Yeah.
aneurysm.
Yeah. Let's not get dragged down on
Uh,
that path.
yeah, so Holy Grail.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think this is a really cool. I think the evolution of the story into the pursuit of the Holy Grail is another thing. And again, I don't really know how Mallory handles it, but I really like the way White handles it. Basically, like that. The reason being that like they've actually like Camelot's working a little too well, and no one has anything to do.
yeah, I mean that's
I'm,
it's
I'm
really interesting.
you.
Like,
I mean, getting onto your territory, you're the summary guy.
right,
So
yeah, fair enough. But yeah, so the kingdom is almost too perfect. The guys get bored. The men in their boredom fall into uh, their 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 previous ways. There's Morgause. She seduces another young man, so her sons kill him. Right, and I think it's one of Pelinor's sons. Right.
yes, yeah,
So there's so much tension between the House of Pelennor and the House of Lot, because
yeah,
Pelennor kills Lot, and then uh, you know the Orkneys being the sort of, they're Scottish, right?
Right.
So they have, White kind of plays a lot with that, where they have this sort of uh, Highlander sort of tribal mentality,
Right.
right? Even I think he even mentions in the second book that Gawain, however you say it, doesn't lose his Scottish accent.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, so there's a lot of that. Sorry, let me pause for one second. Yeah, so there's a lot of tension between those two houses, and it definitely comes to a head before Arthur sends his knights off to go find the Grail. And I'm wondering, well, it's interesting to me, especially because of Lancelot's story, that he's not able to go see the Grail, and even
Hmm.
one of his punishments is that his son Galahad can't return to England
Right.
because he's on. It's not exactly stated, but I interpret it as his blood is tainted.
Mm.
I don't know. What do you think of that? Why can't Galahad return to England?
Well, what wasn't there? And maybe I'm thinking of a different place, but wasn't there kind of this idea that the Galahad in particular, and kind of the knights who were able to achieve the Grail quest, have almost become too holy
Right.
to like return to the everyday. Like it's almost like they went too far. Like Arthur lost these knights to holiness almost.
No, yeah, you're totally right. Yeah, I'm adding I'm adding to the story where it kind of explains that.
Yeah,
Uh,
which is kind of, which is a it's a crazy sort of idea, but there's something really interesting about that to me. Like the pitfalls, all the different pitfalls of all the different phases of Camelot. How hard it is to just keep everything. I think it's one of those things when you're a kid, or when I was a kid, and hearing sort of the King Arthur story, and it's very um, in its very broadest strokes. You sort of think like, oh, it's the story of the perfect king and the perfect kingdom. But one of the things White is really good at exposing is how fleeting that moment of perfection actually
mhm,
is.
right. And I mean
Even
that's the,
even when they're chasing something like the Holy Grail, it still doesn't work. It
right.
doesn't fix it.
And it's still, I mean, like the same way that people remember the Kennedy years as Camelot.
Right.
It's this temporary zenith, right? And everything else is sort of like you're looking at the top of a mountain, and everything else exists below that moment.
Right. Yeah. And every attempt to extend it goes awry in some way, or doesn't last, or brings new problems, or this old problem that happened before Camelot was truly founded comes back.
Yeah, oh yeah. White does an excellent job of setting up all the ways that that Camelot is torn down.
Mhm.
But man, is it awesome for that brief moment.
Yeah, no, yeah. Even though that moment almost doesn't exist, it's still in the book. It's very palpable. You want that moment of just knights questing for the good of England kind of stuff.
And White does an excellent job of making you want it to last longer, and he also does a great job of, like, one could ask, like, was it worth it? Was
Hmm.
Camelot worth all this strife and all everything that happens afterwards? And you can say unequivocally yes.
Yeah.
Oh, it was totally worth it. It was so great. You know, one thing I do like about Galahad is he is he makes up for his father's faults.
Yeah.
Where Lancelot is, kind of unclean and impure, Galahad is pure and holy, and the sins of the father do not fall onto the son.
Hmm.
Because he's born of a love affair. His parents aren't married. His mother kills herself because, and
Right.
I hate to laugh at that, but she kills herself because uh, Lancelot won't marry her and make an honest woman of her. So
Hmm.
he's tainted. He's ruined this woman. You
Right.
know,
And she spent her whole life kind of like waiting for him to do that.
right? It's just like you know, yes, Lancelot is the perfect knight when it comes to questing and fighting and even some of the more some of the aspects of chivalry. But when it
Right.
comes to his personal relationships, he is awful.
Hmm.
He's as ugly as he thinks he is, or as
Right.
ugly as he appears in the mirror. You know,
Hmm.
um, yeah, just really really good nuanced writing by White here. Uh, unless you have anything else, I think we'll move to book 4. No,
No, I think that captures pretty much all the stuff I would say.
The Candle in the Wind, book 4, written by Elton John.
Right.
But even that, like that it's not like Elton John just picked that out of his head. No,
Right.
this story's so pervasive that he's like, oh, well, I'll write this song about Marilyn Monroe and then later Princess Di. Uh,
Hmm.
Based on the title of this King Arthur book.
Yeah, which this one I believe is published late, like it pretty close to 1960, so would have been relatively fresh.
So
Even
yeah, yeah,
in comparison to the other books.
exactly, yeah, yeah. Oh, and it's I think, geez, what's the fifth one called? I didn't read the fifth
Book of
one.
Merlin. I've actually not read Book of Merlin
Maybe
either.
we'll do an
Follow
addendum
up.
episode.
I
You
mean,
and
that's
I.
kind of what Book of Merlin is. I think it's like the addendum, so that
Oh,
would be.
wonderful. So we'll do a follow up for the follow
Yeah,
up, uh, folks. So go ahead and mark your calendars because
that's
Mazer will
right.
be back. Uh,
Yeah, Candle in the Wind is shorter.
yes, yeah. It's sort of it's cleanup, you know.
Yes.
Um, yeah, Candle in the Wind. It starts with Mordred. He hates Arthur, and Lancelot's son. What's his name?
Uh, Galahad or
No, 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 no. Oh, no, 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 not his son. Who's it's Agravain. Agravain, I
oh,
think
okay,
is
okay.
Mordred's brother, right?
Yeah,
One
yeah,
of
yeah,
the Orkneys. Yeah, he hates
yeah, yeah.
Lancelot, right? They're like the two spiteful Orkneys, let's say. Uh, they conspire because everybody like the Guinevere Lancelot affair is an open secret.
Yeah,
Nobody talks
you
about
kind
it.
of get the sense that it's like really an open secret by this point.
Yeah, it's getting like Lancelot in his dumbassery is just so overt, and he's really like if Arthur were just like 5% less of a good guy,
Yes.
like, and again, it's really hard for especially like the modern, let's say, dissident right sphere to kind of like, of course, I can just hear like guys who like Andrew Tate like, oh, just throw her away,
Yeah,
obviously she's.
there's something unmanly about what Arthur is doing.
But at the same time, it's like he's really White does a good job of showing how impossible his position is
Right.
because his virtue won't allow him to seek the justice that he also holds so dear.
Right.
It's really I mean I'm sure plenty of people could say that Arthur is this, that, and the other thing. I like it, and I know that you like it, and hopefully, if you're listening out there, you like it as well.
Yeah, I think he does the work to justify it. I don't think he makes it like just a failing. I think he it's a trap that he's in. The other thing that's kind of happening with that is Guinevere in particular is getting increasingly impatient with this sort of state of this, with the
Right.
skulking around and all that. So the tension within the relationship is also ramping up as the tension sort of around the royal court is ramping up. Like everybody's kind of getting the pressure of all this stuff is getting to be too visible to too many people.
So Arthur decides that he's gonna, basically just go off and go hunting and let the other knights take care of this. But it's really odd because Arthur also just hopes that Lancelot kills everybody and can continue the secret. That's where I say that Arthur's pretty cucked and pretty messed up. Like
Yeah, he does avoid it too
there
long.
he does. There is a little bit of lacking in the balls department with that move there. I will say, as much as I'll kind of do Arthur apologetics, it's hard to defend that one.
Yeah.
Arthur also admits that he was told that Mordred would be evil, that he was the product of incest, and that he gave the order to have a bunch of babies killed. Mordred, however, survives.
Right.
And this is this deep, dark, terrible secret that Arthur has been carrying with him all his life, right?
Right.
To make a terrible reference that I know you'll appreciate, it's like when Luke Skywalker tried to kill Ben Solo in
That's right.
The Last Jedi.
It's very similar to
It's
that.
like, could you
I
imagine?
think I
That movie
even
could
saw
have been
somebody.
good.
I actually think I saw someone making that comparison. I almost think Ryan Johnson made that comparison one time. But
Ew.
but yeah, it's like the good version of that.
Yeah, but
Where
like, and that I'll do a quick aside here because I hate the sequel trilogy, as I know you do as well. And I grew up loving Star Wars. I kind of don't now. I've kind of put that away more or less,
yeah,
but that movie could have been really good, even just if it kept all the same plot beats but was just written better.
yeah.
I think that it could have been everything that Ryan Johnson wanted it to be.
Yeah, well, I think if there's a lot of differences between the two, as much as they have a similar sort of plot point here. But
Right.
the major difference is that Arthur really did something terrible.
Yeah.
Like it's not like White doesn't back away from that.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't treat Arthur with kid gloves. He doesn't try to apologize for Arthur. No, Arthur totally messed up, and he's also very repentant. And I think actually that's also another reason why the Knights probably can't come back to England because Arthur himself has made it such a tainted place because of his inaction. Let's say because of his wrong actions. Even there's just so much that Arthur, as perfect of a kingdom as he made for such a brief moment, it's just built on a foundation of sand and compromise and his own humanity.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's see. Yeah. What happens next in the story? You be summary man for a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this one is a little bit like the second book where it's sort of just that tension continues to build and Mordred continues. I mean, basically, Mordred threatens to expose Arthur's sin, and he sort of makes Arthur confront it. He captures Guinevere. He catches Guinevere and Lancelot in their affair. Like it all just kind of comes to a head, and then eventually winds up. There's a little bit more. There are a few more events that happen, but broadly speaking, it all kind of blows up in Arthur's face. Lancelot's banished. Guinevere is sort of defamed, and then it sort of culminates in a big battle that's sort of, at least in some ways, like the kinds of fights he was getting into at the beginning of forming Camelot, where you have all of these. It's fractured. The rulers who have grievances with each other are starting to split. There's a siege on a castle. They're all fighting again, and it sort of has an open resolution. It doesn't really end, and like it doesn't end with him going off in the boat, like the sort of famous images of Arthur, getting taken away by the. Like it doesn't quite end firmly. It ends more
Right.
with
It's very he kind of tells his story to young Tom,
yeah,
whose job is to keep the legend going.
yeah.
Uh,
So it almost ends before it fully unravels, but just where it's clear that it is unraveling.
right.
And all of the major storylines have hit a climax. It's not like it doesn't have an ending, but in terms of it doesn't have a final scene. It leaves the legend kind of open, and the sort of, I mean, the candle in the wind is the dream of Camelot, and it's sort of about Arthur just trying to find a way to make the story about that dream at the end. Like, please remember this. Remember the peak of the mountain. When you tell of Camelot, tell about the peak of the mountain.
Right. Like, let
And
let them remember me for how I was, kind of thing,
yeah,
and not what I've become.
right.
Uh, I think just so I read the Green Knight, uh, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight
Hmm.
in college, and that was my first sort of tiptoe. Besides, watching The Sword and the Stone as a kid, but it was my
Sure.
first real delve into Arthurian legend, and I just love Sir Gawain. So when his brothers die and when he dies, uh,
Oh, uh-huh.
yeah, it was very tough for me
Yeah.
because I especially Gawain is very different in the Green Knight. He's chaste, he's holy,
Hmm.
and he is allowed like he's not this hard-headed looking for a fight kind of guy
No.
that White and maybe even Mallory to a certain extent portrays him as. But it doesn't matter to me. Like I don't think he was done dirty. I don't dislike this version of him. Um,
Yeah, there's getting at different things in different ways. I
yeah,
do think that, and I do think that again, if we talk about kind of like the virtues of the way White renders all this stuff, the sort of needlessness of some of the violence in this final book, and the frustration at the at Arthur seeing his knights having to kill each other, and like I think all of that is, he grounds those decisions. It's not like it just turns into an action movie. It's every one of them who dies is a tragedy. It's, on the roll call of Camelot.
it's amazing. It's amazing to me that Lancelot kills all of the Orkneys.
Uh-huh.
Well, except Mordred. I guess he
Yeah,
doesn't kill Mordred, but all of the original Orkneys, let's say.
yeah,
Um, yeah. So I mean, Mordred kind of takes over Camelot while Arthur is running off to
right,
go fight Lancelot, and
right.
he's spitefully trying to destroy what was so great. Uh,
Yes,
and then Arthur, of course, returns, and that's sort of the end. We're
right.
given we don't know whether he dies in the fight with Mordred, if he's carried off to heaven. Uh, it's left ambiguous, I think, because
Yes.
Mallory has a couple different endings out there.
Mhm.
That's the once and future king, right
Yeah,
there. Tom of Warwick. He is entrusted that one day Arthur will return.
yeah,
And again, this story, like one of the things that I love about these stories is just it's very clear that they were made as a way to synthesize like the pagan sort of Anglo-Saxon myths with Christianity, because
mhm,
Beowulf is the same way.
yeah.
Uh, and
Yeah, where you feel
there's
the transition from the old northern way of being to the sort of more Christian England, kind of finding a way to
right,
sit itself in that older.
right, and
Yeah.
even just the uh, I think like really great stories come when you sort of take elements from both
Yeah.
and you stay truthful
Hmm.
to them, and you don't try and do too much with them. And one of the things that I don't like about modern storytelling is they've taken these ideas and turned them into tropes. Like, I don't know if you've ever been on
Yeah.
TV Tropes, the website. I've
Yeah,
spent
once or twice, and then I was like, I can't do this.
I've spent many an hour just down rabbit holes there. But like, it's this, they're trying to formulate rather stories.
Yeah.
Like, like they're making stories into a math equation,
Right.
and
Yeah. There's Legos.
yeah, no soul to that. And it's clear that these older works just, they might be doing kind of the same thing. You could view it from like a Joseph Campbell kind of point of view, but it's just different.
Yeah,
And
you get the sense that they didn't let themselves get so far away from it that they could see it as a math problem. Like you get the sense that they were, in this case, they wanted to tell a story about the perfect kingdom and the things that tore it down, and not because that's an interesting trope or something, but because that's an important thing to tell about.
remember, on Canon Fodder, we believe that old thing good, modern thing bad, return to tradition.
That's right. That's right. I do, and again, I will sort of. I think I've said this a few times now. I think White shows a really good way of being a modern person looking at an old text,
Yep.
like in genuinely interacting with it and communicating what he finds meaningful about it, without giving into the desire to change what it is about.
Yeah, and maybe one day we'll get a sort of once and future king retelling of songs of the South.
That's right. Yeah.
Um,
I was left with the thought reading it again of what, not in any strong particular way, but of, what are some other stories that could benefit from a once and future king type sort of renovation,
I mean, I think, especially for children, I think that Beowulf could be pretty cool
Mm-hmm.
if done respectfully. Like, I did not like the movie,
No, yeah.
even with animated Angelina Jolie.
Right.
Never mind. But
I think the difference between us is I was thinking Grendel and you were thinking Angelina Jolie as the high points of that movie. But yeah, no, the Beowulf movie feels too much like, oh well, what if we turned it into the thing that we do?
right.
Um,
Um, I mean, maybe. I mean, there was the Green Knight film that came out
mhm.
a couple of years ago, and I heard very mixed things about that. Uh,
Yeah, I didn't see it. It looked like it was going to get on my nerves. Um, I'd be interested in seeing the Aeneid treated this way.
yeah, yeah, or even the Odyssey, because I mean, we
Hmm.
kind of like the Iliad maybe as well, but I mean,
I think that one's a little almost too familiar to really benefit from this in some
perhaps.
ways.
I mean, and then of course you got Emily Wilson, who's kind of doing that
Yeah,
to the Iliad and the Odyssey,
you have
unfortunately.
to fix them.
Yeah. So I mean, there's got to be a way for us to appreciate things that came from the past and contextualize them so that we can understand them better without apologizing for them and without trying to change what they are to fit modern uh, morality or lack thereof.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah. Anyway.
And I just
Uh,
think, I think my sort of abiding recommendation of this book is, one, it's fun and funny and sad and all those things, but also it's just a good example of one way to do that. Like one way to look back at the past without needing to fix it.
Mazer, my friend, where can people find you? How can people support your work? What are you up to?
Yeah, I haven't done a ton of work. I'm not as prolific as, say, T.R. Hudson,
A few
but
are.
that's true. But I'm trying to do better. I'm gonna see if I can find a byline sometime this year. But for right now, just follow at the next Mazer, and we'll hang out on Twitter. And then, I'd like to, like I said, I'd like to get a byline in a couple places soon. I do have a book I'm trying to write. So if you'd be interested in hearing about any of that as it comes along, that's where I'll be talking about it.
Wonderful. And if you enjoyed this episode, if you enjoy any episode of Canon Fodder, if you enjoy the Double Dealer magazine as a whole, please subscribe to our Substack. Please buy our magazines. And if you really like us, you can become a paid subscriber to our Substack. I want to thank my guest, Mr. Mazer Rackham, for coming. I want to thank you all for listening. And as soon as I come up with a better ending, I'll put it right here.